Nice, and we're recording. So, hello everyone. I'm here with Benjamin Bargetzi. Thanks for joining us on the ACIT Science podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Manu.
Just to give a short overview over who you are, you originally studied neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy in Oxford, London, Singapore, and Zurich. So you've been around quite a lot. And while you're a pretty big science nerd, if I may take the liberty of saying so, you have since moved on to the world of business, and you are currently a senior account manager at Google, and have previously also worked at Amazon in Seattle and London. And I think this intersection between your academic interests and passions, but also your business interests, is quite fascinating. And I think there are a lot of things we can talk about here. But before we move into that, it's quite important that also to emphasize that you are the founder and president of ACIT, the very ACIT that this podcast owes its name to. So it seems highly appropriate that we have this conversation here now.
You're flattering me way too much, Manu, and then I'll only say nonsense later on, and people will be disappointed.
So maybe we can just start with a business world and maybe to go into your motivations about your transitions. What made you move into the world of business, and what fascinates you about it? How can we understand this maybe on a personal level?
Gladly. So I think if you look back in time a bit, like when I was studying like neuroscience, psychology, my life was all about finding out truth in the world. It was all about like investigating the world, exploring it, and understanding what's going on for me specifically in the human mind and in human environments. When humans come together, when they form groups, it was just really like my greatest passion was to understand it from a historical perspective, from an anthropological perspective, and so forth. And then after, so for many years, actually, for me, it was very clear I would eventually end up going into academia, research, and trying to become a professor one day. But then, kind of like as I entered academia, I realized that some processes were a bit too slow for me. It was a bit too bureaucratic for me, and so kind of I realized that I was missing something. So I was kind of missing the drivenness and the efficiency and effectiveness of academic research a bit. And to be very honest with you, like there's no day that passes where I'm not fully convinced that one day I'll return and at least do a PhD or maybe even stay in academia for longer. But for me, back at the time, it was just really okay. Come on, let's see what's out there in the business world, because something I think that really drives me is having impact. So I really love structuring projects, thinking about a big vision, crafting strategy, bringing together the right people, working data driven, and then really creating an impact with that. And I think that's kind of like what drove me to the business world as well, because I think academia is extremely noble in its quest for teaching and uncovering the truth about the world. But I think also if you're looking for very strong impact, it's usually the business world that has that on the world, right? If you really think about it, academia has its highest impact when it's being read by businesses and then being applied and financed. So that's kind of like I was kind of taken out of my beautiful Platonic and Socratic world of intrinsic philosophy, because for me science is a feeder of philosophy. So I'd still consider myself a philosopher primarily and a scientist secondly, who is looking for data to think about. Yeah, I was kind of taken out of this ancient Greek romanticism, I would say, and more like focused on having impact and the material condition we live in. That, well, you need money to create impact sometimes. So I would say my transition to the business world. I'm still a science nerd, as you beautifully put it, but my transition to the business world was more motivated by seeing if I can create impact with that knowledge I gathered. Always knowing though that I will probably return one day to the academia. And so kind of like when the primary motivator for me was to have impact in the business world, I was really clear for me I didn't want to do an assistant role, or I didn't want to do something too repetitive. So I'm not saying these jobs are not important, and if someone enjoys them, that's amazing. I just know that from my own drivenness and from my own restlessness, I needed something that was very changing, very challenging, and, well, to some degree uncertain. So I really like working on a big uncertainty. And so basically, my first career step after my graduation was actually to apply only for like senior roles and for like team leader roles. So right after university, I mean, I did some projects, mostly entrepreneurial projects in high school and in university. One of which, of course, was ACIT, the greatest one I did so far, I would say. Another one was a startup I founded, and basically it was all. I had a lot of entrepreneurial experience, but it was still, of course, very tricky to find a senior leadership role right after graduation. And so what I did was really like spending my time crawling the internet for suitable roles, right? And I was really not country bound. So I think that was a big help in my career so far. That I didn't care if someone told me to work somewhere completely else, as long as I liked the role. And so I ended up in Leipzig, actually, in the end, in Germany, in a rather younger future research institute, where they were kind of like emphasizing on the science of understanding where the world is developing towards, where I could do a nice bridge with my experience in entrepreneurial projects, but also scientific research. And then it's kind of like I managed this first jump within a cool company, but which was, of course, not the biggest company out there. But what I got was I got a scope and a role where I was really able to develop skills, where I was really able to take on big projects and work on a lot of very important hard and soft skills, ranging from data analysis to team leadership to to also talking to C-level stakeholders. And I think that's really one career advice I could give to people, that for your first job, you don't really look at the brand, or you don't really look at what other people will think about you if you do it, but you really look about the skills that you will have when you leave that job. Because to be very honest, we don't live in a world anymore where people stay forever in their jobs. And as you know, our next ACIT Switzerland event that I'm holding will be about the future of working. This was a little advertisement there in between the podcast.
Yeah.
So basically, I would say that knowing that you won't spend your entire life in one company just really means that you should make sure that you develop your skills first. Because if you want to work for a big brand company, you can do so like in a later stage of your career still, right? And it doesn't matter when you do it. A career is a career no matter when it happens. So I think the most important part here for me is really get the skills that you need, right? And I really taught myself that, like, get the skills that you need. And now you might wonder if I had a really good mentor in university or where I know that stuff from. I never had a mentor, to be honest. I was always kind of like, this sounds so sad now. So, and then later people find out I like Nietzsche, so I sound like the ultra expert. But I never really had a mentor, to be honest. I always did things by myself and very independently. And where I got all this knowledge from that I used for my career was really just reading people's stories online, reading blog posts, reading people's self reflection about people who did PhDs, about people who went to brand companies, but in like more like repetitive operational roles. And yeah, I just really read people's stories and I took them seriously, not believing I was better than them, not believing I was worse than them, but just really reading them as people with their own desires, hopes, and drives in life. And that's kind of like what really helped me, having these stories and figuring out which ones suited me, which is why I decided to really try and get into a role with a lot of creative potential. But yeah, then basically after that role in the Future Institute, I was then hired by Amazon via LinkedIn. So having a LinkedIn, I think, is also business advice from me. Then Amazon hired me into a process improvement role across America and Europe, where I was mostly working on making sure that the entire supply chain worked, but I was working on the tech systems behind the supply chain. And now you might wonder how a neuroscientist and psychologist ends up working on Amazon's tech operation systems. Well, it's very easily. It's skills, right? I don't know. I can code a little bit, but I'm not the greatest coder, right? I can work with people, but I'm probably not the best team coach, right? I can structure projects well. I might not also be the best there, but I was the only person probably applying who knew all of it to a decent degree. And that's exactly what I said about the skills. So if you have a lot of skills, um, there are roles out there for you where you can really glue those together and make something out of it, right? And I think that's kind of like for me, what I did often was self-reflecting, really, really challenging myself. Hey, what are my key skills? What are you really good at? And what do you just want to be? So, for example, for me, for a long time, I want to do robotics. I was so fascinated by robotics and AI, and I just want to do robotics research. Or I applied for data science jobs because I really thought, hey, I want to be the cool guy who can code, right? But then, kind of like, I think my career started taking off when I stopped thinking about what I would like to be in some Hollywood movie, you know. I stopped thinking about the role I wanted to represent in the world, like the cool coder nerd, but I was really thinking about, hey, from your biological skills, from your history, from your passions, what are you really good at? And then when I wrote that down, I remember this. It was entrepreneurial leadership, it was project structuring, project management, and it was motivating people and finding consensus within the team and creating harmony. And when I knew these three skills, it was very clear to me that robotics was no longer robotics research was something I still feel very passionate about, but maybe not where I'm best situated. And then from then on, I just really, when this Amazon role came along, and also I've phrased my LinkedIn accordingly. I put my self description and my self reflection in the description text, and Amazon really liked it because they looked for someone who can work very techy, but at the same time likes people, and at the same time can have a strategic overview. And then yeah, so I'm coming to an end now because my career hasn't been that long that it justifies talking any longer about it. But yeah, basically then when I worked for Amazon, I did so in Seattle and across Europe, and eventually decided to move to Google just because I was happy to return to Zurich, back home where I'm living now and where I'm from. Well, not from Zurich, but from Switzerland. And yeah, it also was a cultural move because I think the culture of Google is still a bit more representative of the curiosity and the how do I say this nicely, the kindness I would like to promote in working with others. Whereas I think found Amazon extremely impressive in how big the projects are, but I didn't get along super well with the culture there. So that's, I think, the last advice I have for people. Don't feel obliged to stay in a company because you really like the projects. Decide by culture. So decide by skills that you want to learn, and decide by culture. You must feel well in your work. Otherwise, it's not work. Otherwise, it's torment. So that's, I think, my first two key advices I would have to any of our listeners.
Yeah, if I just ask like the first question and then we get 15 minutes of beautiful career advice, then this podcast is really doing itself. So it was pretty awesome answer. I think there are too many places where we could have like too many interesting ways we could have continued there. So I'm a little confounded now. But maybe what I was initially thinking about asking, and maybe also relates to what you just described with the work culture. Um, do you think there's like a crucial difference between this work culture in academia and the work culture that you mentioned in these big companies? You also mentioned this streamlining and this kind of more efficient approach to develop. And do you think actually that academia could really learn something here from becoming more business-like, or do you think it's necessary for academia to live in this ivory tower kind of Socratic world that you described, and to develop ideas, and then kind of in this closed off idealized space, and then the companies come in and they take these ideas and do something out of them efficiently?
I think the question is amazing. I just would like to take a step back and define the terms a bit, because I think business like is a very dangerous assumption that businesses know what they're doing. So I think it's very few businesses that really have the process in check. Not saying the ones I work for do, but they do it to a quite satisfactory degree. So I would say my experience is also quite biased because I've been mostly working in the tech industry, which is very famous, right, for rethinking processes, for being very agile, for being people focused. So I think that's kind of like also um, an important distinction here. So I would say yes, academia can definitely learn from tech companies. As to be honest, tech companies learn from academia because, for example, Google, kind of the way you work there, it's very similar to how you were at university, right? It's kind of similar, I think, to being a student and to want to learn and stuff like that. So I would say yes, academia can definitely learn a lot from modern tech companies, but it doesn't just mean any business, because I think a lot of businesses they're very hierarchically driven. They're very unflexible in how they operate and how they do business. And I think their academia, so depending on the team, depending on the institution, might even be better than some businesses. So I think it's not that easy to make this clear cut. But when you ask me about if the average research groups that I worked with is not performing as effectively as the average company I worked at, then yes, from my own sample size, I can definitely confirm that. And I think academia should copy work styles from the business world. So I think it's especially three things that I come to mind here. One is speed. So I think academia is often very just people are not as rushed, and I think that's good for your well-being, but it's bad for production. So I think finding a good balance between speed and well-being would be cool for academia. I find Google does it very well to find this balance. Amazon is a bit more on the speed side and less on the well-being side. But I think academia is a bit too much on the chill side and then not enough on the speed side. So here I think a bit more drive would be important. And what does drive mean, right? Drive is an individual decision, but it can also be something how you think about the entire institution. So having clearer deadlines, having more, not healthy competition in a sense of, like really working together and trying to like be better than the other, but like still doing it in a respectful way, right? I think these kind of elements, like a bit more drive, would be great. A second thing I was talking about is maybe this financial dependency. So it's kind of like, right, you're doing research and then you're kind of waiting for a company to pick it up. I mean, a lot of startups develop out of academia, and I think that's actually really cool. If you research something for your whole life and then you decide to bring it to the business world, or what does the business world mean? I mean, business world sounds like this mean other realm, right, where there's a lot of people greedy for money. I think what you can say is take it out to the civil world, rather just the civil life of people, right? Because I think way more people are affected by businesses offering their services and products than people are affected by what's happening in academia, right? I think academia still to some degree is quite an elitistic institution where only a very small percentage of the world actually cares about what's going on in science. And I think that's also why I like the business world a bit more, because it's really like, if you create an impact in the business world, you can scale it across the world, right? You can bring it to people who never had the chance to actually attend academia, right? And I think that's why I talk about impact with business, because business usually, if you think about products that everyone is using, right? If you think about, you can just really you can think about anything you're using every day. I'm not trying to make examples now, because the first thing I wanted to say was Google search, so I shouldn't say that. But yeah, if you just think about things that people use in their daily life, right? I think it's quite amazing how scaled your impact can be. And I think academia is not as scaled as that, but it could be if more people had the courage, I think, to transform their research into an answer to a problem in the world, and then really provide that to people. So I think, yeah, one is a bit drive. I thought academia, for my taste, was a bit not driven enough, or not the speed component was a bit lacking. And please, Manu, you as a very successful PhD researcher, please correct me if this is wrong. But then the second one is, yeah, I thought it was not so scalable, because it's a very small circle of people, and I think working on the scalability would be something. And then the third part, I think in general, is also a bit about this ivory tower that you mentioned, right? So I think we should not be. I think it's a difference in doing science and philosophy for the purpose of solving truths in the world, and in just getting citations and papers that everyone likes, right? So I think there is the ivory tower. To some degree, you need to keep it, because I think it's also attractive about academia to have this space to really nurture your thoughts and really develop it. But at the same time, I think oftentimes I'm not sure if the people I met in my research time, if they were really caring about finding the truth, or it was more like, hey, I'm doing research because there's nothing else I can think of right now in the business world, or if it's also just, yeah, lets me get some publications, then I get promoted, and then I become a professor one day and my salary increases. So if it's these kind of aspirations people have, then I kind of, it's very similar to like the uncool business world, I would say, where people are just working to get promoted and to get their salary. So I think as long as you're really passionate about what you're doing and you believe in a higher cause of what you're doing, it doesn't matter if you're working in a business or in academia. I'm just not always so sure if this entire publication system within academia really does justice to the many, many people I know willingly make the sacrifice of earning a bit less in academia compared to business world, seeking, however, a higher cause. And I think that higher cause is often a bit betrayed, because that's also what I felt. Like I was really willing to go into research because I was really motivated by the greater cause of, like, contributing something to the understanding of the universe. But then kind of like this whole publication system and everything around that, it didn't feel very authentic anymore. And so, yeah, I'm not saying business is more authentic. I'm just saying that since business is more diverse in what you can do there than academia, it's easier, I think, to find a place there that makes you happy, probably. So I think academia is also a very tough choice at the end of the day, and I think this is very important to stress that it's not easy work, right? It's very challenging to stay on top of your projects, to stay on top of your field. Whereas in business world, you might just have a job that is a bit less complex and dynamic than that. So yeah, wrapping this up, I would say that it's very hard to make a clear distinction between academia and business. I would just, as I said just now, outline a few key differences that just again from my personal experience that I observed.
Mm. Yeah, I think I'm not feeling too offended because my PhD is more in the AI direction, which I think already is pretty closely linked to business. I mean, Google and Amazon obviously do a lot of important work, and famous AI researcher like Jan LeCun are now at Facebook or Google, and actually there's
Yeah,
a lot of
exactly. Yeah.
overlap already in that field. So I think the criticisms that you gave for this ivory tower view, I think, hold more strongly for other fields. And I think, yeah, academia is also not a homogeneous structure,
Exactly. Yeah.
and probably there's, yeah, a lot of stuff being learned, especially when it comes in the tech sector of academia. I think it's being realized that it's really not a lot of value to just sit in your room and develop an amazing algorithm that could help potentially hundreds of millions of people, but no one
Yeah,
is caring about it. So I think
absolutely.
this thinking about impact is becoming like more strongly realized, especially in the AI field, because there's so obviously so much impact there.
But I think also, like in here, just a very important side mark to make for our listeners, right? It doesn't mean that you have to do something related to tech in order to have impact. Like you can really just, if you think about, if you find a mental health treatment for people, if you develop a new medication that really helps people, if you, or even if it's not only about helping people, even if you figure out a fundamental physical truth, which can then be used by other people one day to develop something again that makes the world better, I think that's all really noble. I think the only thing I was saying is, when you're doing academic research, when you're really committing yourself to this world, think about what's the purpose behind it. Think about what you're doing it for. And don't always think the business world is cooler than that, because very often then not, it's not. So that's, I think the key message of me was not to say, hey, everyone leave academia and go work in business. No, I think my key message was, it is a noble cause, but really ask yourself what you're doing it for, and what's the goal you have in the end. Because for me, it will be the same. I will leave my super cool, high paying business jobs, and I will go back to being a PhD student one day, and I know that for sure. And I say, hey, that's absolutely okay for me, because what I promised myself from diving deep into this literature and diving deep into the human brain and what's happening to consciousness, what's happening to human behavior, to emotions. I think that fascinates me so much that I say, yes, that is fine enough for me. And then the second question I will have to ask myself, okay, what kind of projects do you want to do? Which of them are just for your own pleasure of finding out stuff about the world? And which one of them might be giving something back to people across the world, right? And yeah, that was my key message, I think. Not that academia is not cool, but that no matter if you're in business or in academia, you need a purpose in what you're doing.
Now that we've already mentioned academia so much, maybe we can actually segue to academic topics to
Of
say
course.
to to let it save face in the face of this. Um, yeah, maybe one first question, which still kind of connects to the previous points, is whether you think that really psychological research in the last couple of years, or like if you can think of any big psychological breakthroughs or insights that have changed the way you see people working best, how to structure work, how to structure maybe teamwork, how to structure teams. Do you
Mhm.
think there's any big insights on that front that have
I
helped you?
I think so. I think if you talk about psychological, like high impact things in general, I mean, um, the very first one you think about will probably be Freud, who really like brought up the discussion that not much of our brain is really under our control, but a lot of it is happening subconscious. And then kind of like the recent work of Daniel Kahneman with the whole cognitive bias literature. I think this is kind of goes into the Freudian distinction between a conscious and a subconscious part of the brain. I think that one has become extremely powerful when it comes to HR hiring, right? That you don't have biases in how you hire people. It's also a lot in marketing, right? How people are biased to like something or not. It's in everything, right? So in group discussions, so for example, groupthink, right? The phenomenon where people in groups tend to become more extreme than when they are alone. I think all these reflections on these automatic mechanisms that we have in our brains, these very often evolutionarily adaptive mechanisms that can, however, produce wrong outcomes or um, not benevolent outcomes in the modern world. I would say this is a very important literature. So if one of our listeners hasn't read up on it, please reach out to me on LinkedIn right after this podcast, and I'll send you a huge reading list, because I think really that's one of the books that really changed my entire worldview. Right, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Of course, you always had heard about Freud and the subconscious and the conscious, but I think really what Kahneman did was a very disciplined and scientific approach to describing this subconscious and its outcomes, so to say. And I think that's an extremely valuable view to have on the world. Not in the sense, and I see this often with people thinking, "Oh yeah, everyone else is biased, but I am but I am the one only rational in this room." But more
Yeah.
really to develop a humble view, saying, "Hey, we're all have amazing brains. We all have amazing tools at our command, but they're erroneous. They can make mistakes, right?" And so to see your own decision making as a statistical process where you are quite likely right, but not always, I think it creates a humility and a humbleness that really every team and every business and academia can benefit from. If you think more about also like how people can be happy in their roles. I mean, what Google is really doing, and that's also something I really appreciate, Google is taking modern psychological research very serious in how they change their programs and how they approach well-being of their employees. So, for example, in Google, you do psychology tests, right? We had this cool psychology test that is based on Jungian psychology about these four colors. I don't know if you know that one. It's just
Yeah.
basically, the red, blue, yellow and green color, which just is a very, very, of course, rough estimate of how you are as a person. And that's kind of like we did this test just to really see like, hey, who in our team needs what, who in our team cares about what kind of things. And for example, someone maybe likes more to talk about numbers, someone really is more on the social side and likes to talk about people first, right? And then we kind of like did that to really understand how we best can communicate with each other. Or other things which we didn't do at Google yet, but I think is really strong, is, for example, the Big Five model in personality psychology, which is to date, I think, one of the best proven psychological theories. It's basically just about saying that people mostly differ on five dimensions, like openness to new experience, extraversion versus introversion, neuroticism, so the emotional stability of people, conscientiousness, which is kind of like how diligent you're working, but also like how much drive you have, and then agreeableness, which is like the degree to which you adjust to groups and to the opinions of others. And I think if you really understand and take this seriously, and actually in almost all of my keynotes now, I bring this one slide about the big five, and yeah, it will be in the future of working keynote that I will be giving soon. It's kind of like, I think, very important to understand that people can change, people can develop in their lives, right? We are not fully programmed machines that just yeah, act on impulse only. But I do believe that biology is a very important factor, and certain people are wired in different ways. And I think respecting that and really respecting the individual and their personal needs for how much social closeness is okay for them, how much independency is okay for them, how much pressure is okay for them. I think also what kind of language, for example, depending on who I talk to, I might be more like, provoking the person a bit for fun, right? Yeah, like in a very friendly way, like saying like, oh, come on, you can do that better and stuff like that, right? And then the person laughs and is like, yeah, yeah, come on, I'm going to show you. Whereas with other people, I know that saying something like this will probably hurt them. And I think that's really the empathy that we can learn from psychological research. So I've both things I mentioned now, these examples like personality tests or cognitive biases, I think it creates empathy for understanding how other people think, how other people feel, what is important to them, and most importantly, what is different for them than it is for you, because the world that you see is your world. It's not the world that other people see, right? And I think that's what psychology can teach us, other than, of course, self-reflection. It's like looking at yourself and being like, hey, I'm always trying to be the extrovert guy, but maybe I'm not. And that's okay, right? Same like what I said before. I try to be the data analyst, and I try to be the data scientist and the coder and robotics guy. So I try to be a very analytical and very numbers driven guy. And I would say I'm very, very data driven in how I do things. But for me, it's always only important, hey, what does this data say about the next action? What does this data say about the next action step in our project? So for me, I'm a project driver. I'm not the analyst. I'm not the product developer. I'm not the robotics guy. I'm the guy who drives projects. I could work in a robotics development team, but I would be the one bringing together people. I would be the one structuring ideas. I'm not the one who is really like, crunching the numbers and really developing the models, even though I always wanted to be this, right? And it's still a hobby of me. But I think that's kind of like also what psychology can really help us with, and a company, of course, if we really know ourselves and what each other like and what everyone likes in your team, and if you really have the courage also to accept that other people think in different ways. I think that's where I really see a big benefit of psychology for business. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, with respect to cognitive biases, it's quite interesting. There's also this beautifully named book by Carol Teffers called "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me," which beautifully illustrates this. I think, yeah, if we actually understand that everyone is biased, including ourselves, that can give a lot of empathy
Yeah,
and help us really understand people better and, yeah, just not take ourselves too seriously. Also reminds me of this Jungian perspective of kind of integrating subconscious parts of your personality, this kind of this shadow, this darker part of yourself
yeah.
that is judgmental and potentially racist and all these kind of things, to really understand that your own mind has the potential to do that.
Definitely, like knowing that your own mind is capable of very weird and sometimes horrible things, and also knowing that even if someone has really good intentions, they can still make mistakes because the brain is statistically performing and not deterministically. I think that's really humbling for yourself, as I said before, but also makes you understand people better. And I think the right approach here is not to tell them, oh yeah, look, you're biased here, let me tell you why I'm enlightened. But I think the right approach is saying like, hey, okay, cool, let's maybe our group discussion we had, let's write it down and objectively let it be reviewed by someone else, to see if we really have if we really make sense here. So I think debiasing practices in HR, in hiring, in business, in promotions and stuff like that, but also, as I said before, taking care of taking into account like how people feel and what they need from personality and emotion research. I think it's super key. So, and one easy way to implement it, by the way, is to just talk to people. So I think communication is just really the one thing you learn from psychology at the end of the day, to be honest, is really communication, careful communication, empathetic communication, understanding people and asking the right questions to create a nurturing environment for people where they can really express their feelings and where they can really tell you what they need. And then, well, of course, you provide them with what they need if it's possible to give them purpose and happiness in their roles. I think that's really the biggest benefit that psychology can bring to a business, like really understanding internally, really understanding how to make people want to stay in your company and how to make people happy. And I think if you think about business and psychology and business on an external level, then of course you have something like marketing, where it's very helpful to know psychological models to develop advertisement and negotiations with partnerships and stuff like that. So I think there's really, really, really a lot you can do with psychology in a business role if you just really think about what you're good at. And if, yeah, again, if there's any podcast listener who's very unsure about their career, who doesn't know where to go next, who's maybe a psychologist and doesn't know how to enter the business world, but also someone who's something entirely different and would like to go into a career field that they previously haven't thought about, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Really, like you're talking to a psychology and neuroscience guy who ended up working in tech optimization roles at Amazon and now is doing partnerships at Google. So kind of like, yeah, nothing is impossible as long as you focus on skills and focus on what you can really do yourself.
Talking about cognitive biases, I think it's also kind of interesting that it connects modern psychology or everyday psychology to an evolutionary perspective. And we've at one point also co-hosted an event on the free energy principle and its relationships to cognitive biases. And it also gives a nice connection between biases and this evolutionary perspective or this more fundamental perspective on cognitive science. So maybe we can move into this direction a little more
Absolutely,
and talk about the free
absolutely.
energy principle, since we've already mentioned this a couple of times on this podcast. So it will connect nicely to robotics talks and AI talks as well.
Yeah, gladly, gladly. So, so then I would say, like, let's leave the career world behind and step back into our ivory tower.
Mhm.
So, would you like me to say something specifically, or just like talk broadly, or?
Yeah, maybe we can just start with a short, yeah, how you would conceptualize the free energy principle, not on a purely technical mathematical
Yeah.
level, but what you think the key insight from a psychological perspective is and
Yeah.
how it relates to biases.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, gladly. So I think a first disclaimer here is that I know Carl Friston very well personally, and I'm a huge fan of him and his work. So always feel free to challenge what I say because I really, really fell in love with this theory. But basically, the free energy principle on a psychological or neuroscientific level is the idea that the brain is a statistical tool which is testing hypotheses against the evidence we have in the world, which is a Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is not the first one in the free energy principle. So I will later mention what makes it unique. But basically, the idea here is that the brain, it is said that the brain works by creating hypotheses about the world, like, okay, cool, this door here is open. Then your body acts to prove or disprove this hypothesis. So you try to open the door and it's not open. And then you have a prediction error. So your prediction was not accurate, right? And then you update your world model and saying, oh, okay, the door is closed. And then from this updating, action happens again, where you actually, turn the key and open the door. So basically, I think in the free energy principle, what's unique compared to this Bayesian brain hypothesis is really that the idea that perception and action are not two separate processes. So it was very often thought you have these models of human behavior where you have like inputs, like stimuli coming in, then you have some kind of processing happening in the brain, and you work with like mental models and representations, and then from that comes action. And in the free energy principle, or at least Carl Friston's approach to it, these are two unified things. So basically, like for Spinoza, you have res extensa and res cogitans as two different sides of the same coin. I would say in the free energy principle, it's the same with thought and action. So basically, you really have, it's really basically the same from different perspective. And so in the free entry principle, also what Carl said, for example, was that you only perceive to act. And I think that's a very, very big statement, actually, right? Because if you think about, if you just sit on your balcony and look over the nature and observe what's happening, it's not really clear that you're preparing an action here. But he would say every perception that you make is really just a preparation for action, and driven by the desire to update your world models, to have the correct models about the world, to have the correct combinations in your brain of something something is something something. So to have these, or when I do X, then Y follows. So having these correct causal relationships and descriptive relationships in your mind is really crucial, of course, from an evolutionary perspective to survive, achieve your goals, and pass on your genes. And that's basically what the free energy principle would claim, that everything you do in your life is just a statistical reaction to your brain machine processing information and updating your world models and frequently testing what is happening out there. And how it is important to a evolutionary perspective is, of course, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes more sense for humans to be risk averse, or very often it makes more sense for us to avoid dangers and to focus a bit on the negative, for example. And then if you think about cognitive biases, for example, loss aversion in prospect theory, it's again, right, losses loom larger than gains. So losing something is intrinsically worse for people than not gaining something. And that's kind of like, again, because in evolutionary terms, losing your life is probably worse than not gaining some additional benefit. That's also why we have negativity bias, and why I think a lot of people are unhappy, because our brains are just wired to focus more on the negative than on the positive. And then in FEP terms, it would mean just, yeah, your brain is wired more to draw actions based on negative and potentially threatening information than on potential positive and growth information. And so in the talk that Manu and I did together, basically what we did was really comparing also cognitive biases to this process in the free energy principle of prediction errors and of model updating. And then if you have something like, for example, the anchor heuristic, where if you're asked to estimate, for example, the number of countries in Africa, and before that you heard some random number, you're kind of using that number as an anchor, and then the estimate you're making is closer to that random number, which of course is completely nonsensical. But it is a heuristic that the brain is applying when it has too much uncertainty going on. And so basically this anchor, again, is just the way how in the free energy principle you use some prior, no matter if it's good or bad one, you use some prior and compare it to the world, and then you just try. It's a try and error thing, right? Which brings in the entire reinforcement learning research and the whole dopamine research. But you're basically comparing your priors, so your prior models of the reality, to the sensory data that you're getting in, and you're using this to update your model. And very important, again, this is an active inference. So you're actively seeking out ways to prove or disprove your models, and then kind of like adjust your world. And I mean, adjusting your world, that can happen either by saying, okay, my previous model was wrong, let me create a new one that is better. Or it can be that you stick to your old models and you don't want to change. And that's also where a lot of biases come in, that when you update your world models, but you don't like what the update suggests, you just reject it and stay within your previous knowledge and kind of rationalize this other explanation, which brings in things like confirmation bias and recency effects and so forth.
Yeah, I think one crucial terminology in the free energy principle is uncertainty. I
Yeah.
think it can also really help us, maybe also in these current times, understand some of the biases induced by our brain being constantly forced or having this really strong internal incentive to reduce this uncertainty again.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on this, how this
Absolutely,
can lead to
absolutely.
problems?
I was actually kind of saving this for last, but that's perfect time. Not just because I maybe for the listeners, I spent my entire time in academic research, researching uncertainty. Like that was the only thing I was actually really researching with a lot of passion, and that's really uncertainty. You can think about it as as a state of incomplete information, right? And that kind of like sounds so abstract, and you shouldn't think about it, as this. Whenever I hear uncertainty, I think about a dark cloud, this dark cloud kind of like shying me away from the platonic sun at the end of the cave. But it's like I think uncertainty is really something intrinsically built into the world, right? It's something. The world is so complex and dynamic that you always have, or almost always have, very limited and missing information about what's actually going on, and if your decisions were the right one, right? And that's kind of like hindsight bias and these kind of things that come in there. But basically, um, what I really was looking at is how do people react to uncertainty? And there was things like, okay, how do people change their behavior to uncertainty if they get more tired? That's one of my research projects where the conclusion was, okay, if people get more tired, they just stop caring about uncertainty and they just try to push their current models much stronger. Or another project that I sadly didn't get to finish yet was about how does uncertainty affect motivation. So if you really believe you can do something, but then a lot of uncertain information exists in the tasks that you want to do. How does this affect your self confidence? And things like that. And so, kind of like, of course, why I was also drawn to the free energy principle was why it provides a very strong account for uncertainty. So basically, the free energy principle would say that everything that's happening with this active inference happens for the sake of reducing and resolving uncertainty that we have about our internal states, like what's happening within us, but also about the world around us. And so I think this drive to reduce uncertainty by acting is the core message of active inference, which I would say is the psychological way of describing the free energy principle. So the free energy principle is a mathematical way of describing properties in the world. And then the active inference is just a psychological theory from that, which is based a lot on Helmholtz and other more classic psychologists, but of course also on the Bayesian brain hypothesis. But I think the central message is really we have an intrinsic desire to resolve uncertainty. We do so by acting upon the world and figuring out new information. And the way to resolve uncertainty is either by lying to ourselves and by creating false models which are pleasant for us, or by really being open and updating your world models towards the correct ones.
There's a beautiful apparent paradox in there because in the beginning you mentioned that you really enjoy seeking out these uncertain environments where uncertainty is actually to a degree maximized. So how would you resolve that issue and maybe also connect it to these personality types and this openness dimension where
Yeah, I love this. Thank you very much for this. Yeah, and this is also I think something I'm actually really interested in researching when I go back to academia. So I'm not sure if the problem. I gave this a lot of thought because also like I realized that for myself, I do everything that my favorite academic theory is saying. I don't really do it, right? I really love uncertainty. I hate it when I know things. I hate it when I understand what's going on and if things are controlled. For example, as you know, I also play a lot of strategy games. And for every game, as soon as I made it to the world top ranking, right, I stopped the game. I stopped playing it because the uncertainty decreased too much for myself. So then I think to resolve this paradox, we can think about two things. Either we define uncertainty wrong here, and I didn't use the term carefully enough, or it might just be that the theory is very closely linked to certain personality traits, as you said. So if we explore the second idea first, I mean, of course, there's like openness to new experience within the big five personality factors. And I think being open to new experience kind of like means that you love a part of uncertainty, right? So it's kind of means that you really love being in ambiguous situations and really, yeah, also having a sensation-seeking personality, maybe where you're really trying to get in a lot of information, a lot of new stimuli, and so just trying out something new. I mean, everyone does that, right? Like, just okay, cool. Let's this weekend, let's go somewhere we never went before. So to some degree, this uncertainty is also very alluring, right? And I think it just differs in how open people are to new experiences, how much they're seeking this out. So I think then going back to the first hypothesis I had about uncertainty being wrongly defined, I think that might be the actual issue here. So maybe uncertainty is not so much about not knowing or maybe uncertainty is more about really having incomplete information to make good decisions. Because even if I say, hey, let's go somewhere I don't know about, you kind of still, you kind of still know where you're going. You have been traveling before, right? You kind of still have an idea of how you're going to approach things. And I think that's the same for me. So I love seeking out uncertainty, but I mean, I would also not just throw away my job now and end my relationship just to be in a state of complete uncertainty what's going to happen in my life next. So I think there is a degree here. It's not a 1-0 binary thing. It's a degree where things change from exploring the unknown towards actually scary uncertainty. And I think there are people who thrive more under uncertainty than others, but I do believe that at the core of it, right, very few people would actually like to seek out very strong uncertainty about what's happening. So I think to some degree, you could also say enjoying uncertainty is a privilege because it means that you're probably confident about your life, that you have a backup plan if things go wrong, right? I think if you're really living in very strong uncertainty and you're not sure how to get food on the table next day, or you're not sure if this next decision will end your career or not, I think finding people who really enjoy that and do not show some sign of, let's say, unhealthy sensation seeking is going to be very tricky. So I think the paradox can be resolved if we stop thinking about uncertainty as a yes or no thing, but as a gradual degree where some degree of uncertainty can be enjoyable for people seeking openness, but overall, a very strong degree of uncertainty is probably something people would like to avoid. And I think it's also within a materialistic context. So I think taking away from the FEP and bringing it more to a sociological perspective, maybe. I think again, it's tied. The uncertainty is tied to the outcome of the gamble you're playing. So if you're uncertain about a very important life decision, I don't think people really enjoyed it. I think there's still a lot of thought about the consequences of the action, which is where this whole loss aversion topics comes back in. So I think what I would say is that uncertainty is a degree and not a binary variable, and also I would say uncertainty is always related to its outcomes. And if the outcomes are not so valuable to you, then maybe the uncertainty can be pleasant to you, right? But if the outcomes are really, really key for you, I do not think that you ever want to experience uncertainty. So basically, I think we have to think about the triangle of uncertainty, the outcomes of the decision you're about to make, and also your utility function, like how you think about the world and what you value.
Yeah, you used an important word here, gamble, which relates the whole question of uncertainty also to dopamine. I don't know if you read some of the literature there, but it's something I've been thinking about as well recently. That dopamine really is. It's not about pleasure and reward, but it's more about these prediction errors, actually,
Yeah.
like reward prediction errors, and relates nicely to this kind of dopamine is also involved in addictions, for example, because when you play roulette, for example, you have great uncertainty, but uncertainty to a degree where it can like perfectly is on the edge between giving you a really nice reward that is awesome for you, but also the potential for losing something. But
Yeah.
if you shift the odds here too much, if there's basically no chance of winning anything, then this uncertainty doesn't give you that kick anymore. So it's probably thriving in these situations, as you also described, where dopamine is maximized, and then it has kind of this like strong addictive almost component of you could succeed, but you could potentially also not succeed, and there's also always novelty involved and always novelty coming from
Yeah.
that.
No, but actually, I'm very familiar with the literature. Actually, I wrote a big chunk of my graduation thesis on dopamine in prediction errors, and also when I was in Singapore, we desperately tried to find the genetic markers. I was working on a gene project where we were looking for the genetic markers that distinguish dopamine used in something like the hippocampus activation and memory versus dopamine involved in actual uncertainty related gambling. So that was a big project I was working on. MAOA2 was our candidate, but of course this is still work in progress again that I plan to pick up and finish once I hopefully return to academia. But going back to what you said, I think that's very important. Like dopamine, I think dopamine is, to me, right, it's the most fascinating neurotransmitter in the brain. I think I mentioned this before, I think, as well, like the whole updating process. I mentioned that this ties to reinforcement learning and to the whole dopamine literature. I think I quickly mentioned this when I was talking about the FEP. So I do believe that these dopamine circuits, from the literature I reviewed, I do believe it's actually the carrier to some degree of these prediction error updating loops, and that also, of course, means that people with that also means that you can again think about, okay, how can we tie different levels of dopamine in the brain to different personality types, right? Might that actually be a key driver of how the big five are biologically implemented, right? Or maybe people with higher level of dopamine quicker able to update their world models, therefore getting more easily bored, therefore being more sensation seeking and like also more open to new experience. And might we know that dopamine, higher levels of dopamine, are also associated with higher risk seeking. So that would of course be would be an interesting view. And I think dopamine has been described as wanting, as seeking, but also as prediction errors. So I think again here I wouldn't approach it binary. I would say, okay, cool, dopamine is capable enough of doing both. So I would say at the same time, dopamine could be a wanting driver, but it could also be these prediction error drivers. And I mean, the only world where you really need to decide between these two theories is when you say, okay, the entire brain is only governed by a prediction error system. Whereas when you say, okay, cool, the FEP is one of, let's say, three theories that describe the brain fully, then kind of like you can also have multifunctions for one neurotransmitter. And that's, I think, also like my intrinsic quest I hope to do in my PhD, really finding out whether the FEP is like the one theory to describe the brain, or if it's like one of many that together can explain the brain well, like one of a few meta theories, or if at the end of the day it might not be true. I don't believe so, but a scientist should always be open to throw away their theories, of course.
Yeah, and sometimes the problem with two like unifying theories is that they, at some edge cases or in some cases, are
Exactly.
not the most useful way of describing things, even though it might be true on a fundamental level. It's like taking the Schrödinger equation to describe like personality types is quite useless.
I just want to say, like when you were talking about the different description levels and the problem of combining them, I could hear your pain as a physicist or as a former physicist when you think about quantum physics and Einstein's relativity theory.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's actually quite interesting. I didn't know that you were so looking so much into dopamine. It's also like from my personal experience working in the direction of mental health. It's also like believed to be involved in pretty much all mental illnesses from schizophrenia to ADHD to obsessive compulsive disorder. So dopamine seems to be really key here in shaping the way our brain functions. And I think you also mentioned that kind of there's this very interesting mutation at, I think, in dopamine D2 receptors that makes people much more risk seeking, and like a lot of the people wingsuiting away and dying from jumping off buildings have this mutation, which you can actually, weirdly enough, this mutation is like a high predictor for dying like 30 years earlier than you would usually do, just because like your dopamine sensitivity is weirdly adjusted here.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what I was also trying to say, right? Like we don't need to think about, if you read something like this bias literature, or if you read something like the FAP, you could think, okay, being more uncertainty resolving is better, or you could think something like, okay, being more rational, less emotion focus is better, or you could always come up with these better or worse ideas, but I think that's not what I care about. I don't study neuroscience and psychology to talk about what's better and worse. I think what really I care about is, okay, understanding and doing justice to the fact that a lot of people are very differently wired. A lot of people have very different skills, hopes, pains, and other things in their life, and then really thinking about how to help these people. For example, as you mentioned, if we find out that a certain mutation is causing higher suicide rates, the next question would be, okay, cool, is there a treatment for that, right? Could we think about? I remember when I was in Singapore, there was this project I want to do with these metal plates that you put on your brain, and then kind of like send electrical discharges into brain regions known to be associated with overproduction of dopamine and kind of block it from producing so people could stop their addictions, right? And of course, this sounds super science fiction and scary when you think about sending electrical discharges into people's brain to stop them from their addictions. But I mean, this idea, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying these kind of ideas, and to link it back to the beginning of our podcast, this is kind of like I think what you should think about. So if you're a researcher at the beginning, I mean, where we talked about business versus academia. So when you really think about, okay, cool, I found out now very certainly that this mutation is causing people to commit suicide. What can I do? And then to really think about in technological terms, or also getting someone on board who knows it if you're not so good with that, and really thinking about how to shape this into a new gift to the world, into a new betterment, and into something you can really scale across the world. I think that's something academia should concern itself more to. So exactly what you just mentioned, just making the next step and thinking, okay, how can we actually use this to create value across the world, and not just make it disappear in the university folders, only to be read by a few people across the world.
So I'm a little mindful of your time now because we said we want to talk for 1 hour and we still have Nietzsche and ACIT to cover. So
Oh, no. I really, that's absolutely fine. Like it's, I'm off today, and yeah, it's my fault for talking so much. So no. Let's go on. That's absolutely
no,
fine
no. I mean, I think we could also talk about these psychology and neuroscience topics for many more
for
hours.
another 5 hours. Absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, to move more into philosophical direction because it's also like a big passion
Mhm.
of yours and a common passion of ours. So maybe what is who is like what is your favorite philosophical theory, if there's any, or if it actually makes sense to phrase it that way,
Yeah.
and how does it help you? Maybe also just from a day-to-day basis.
I think again, being not a very black and white person, but really living in the gray zones. I do not have like one favorite theory. I would say authors that really inspired me were, well, Nietzsche, that for sure. Then I think I would also say, like, I really liked Spinoza and his ethics, like where he tried to find a mathematical proof for how to live your life. I'm not saying I actually agree with him, but I just found the project so beautiful where we really tried to break it down. And then kind of like I'm also like I very deeply read into the Buddhist and Confucian literature. So, and also I lived many years in East Asia. So I think also that's a big impact on me. Like I really try to understand Chinese thinking, for example, modern Chinese thinking, by reading deeply into Confucian literature and the system that lies behind it. I also read very deeply into Buddhism, which in the West has well influenced a lot of existentialism, I would say, like something like Schopenhauer, or also like Hermann Hesse with his book Siddhartha and Steppenwolf. So these are kind of like, I think, really key influences on me. But if you really would say, okay, what's the number one biggest influence? It's definitely got to be Nietzsche. Like I cannot lie about it. I know it's a very tricky topic because I think the greatest weirdos in the world are Nietzsche fans, and I think Nietzschean philosophy also draws a lot of very extreme people to it. But I still do believe that you shouldn't judge a philosophy by the people who like it, but you should judge it intrinsically. And I just think what Nietzsche did in analyzing the world, in critically analyzing human nature, and I'm not even talking about Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is more like, a very radical book. I'm really talking about Beyond Good and Evil, or the Genealogy of Morals, which I think are his two greatest books. I just think the clearness of his thinking and how he, at the same time, writes very, very annoyingly metaphorically, but also very clearly at the end of the day. I think it's fascinating how he speaks to emotion more than rationality. And as a person who usually really reads a lot about, who really reads things rationally and data driven, I really enjoy Nietzschean philosophy as a complementary way to that. The same way I really enjoy Buddhist literature as a complementary view to my scientific view. Just, yeah, again, in the hope of not being distracted. So to answer your question precisely, I think the three sources that influenced my philosophy the most were Nietzsche, neuroscience, and at the end of the day, Confucian and Buddhist literature.
Yeah, I think the issue with Nietzsche is that he was just such an amazing writer and made such great use of. He was probably one of the greatest writers the German language ever saw, and
I believe so.
that
Yeah.
also makes him kind of, yeah, sometimes maybe too appealing, or he's a lot of people are drawn to him because there's also a lot of stuff found in him, and his metaphorical allegorical style makes him like easy to misquote, to misunderstand.
Uh,
I had a Nietzsche
uh-huh.
seminar at one point, and he had that he quoted that brilliant quote. So whoever is quoting Nietzsche is lying, referring to the fact that at a different point in Nietzsche's work, you probably found the opposite
Yeah,
statement,
yeah, yeah,
which is
absolutely. No,
proven.
no. And I remember also when I once I attended the annual Nietzsche colloquium in Sils Maria, where Nietzsche lived, and that like a Nietzsche congress, and they're also like I found it hilarious when kind of like the if you look at the people there, right? You had like such a diverse audience, right? Even within the academic researchers, like people really reading Nietzsche in different ways, and I mean Nietzsche really as soon as you have any cause in your life that separates you from other people, you can bring Nietzsche into it, right? Because he always talks about, you being this lone wolf, and there's the masses out there who don't understand you and stuff like that. So I think as soon as you have anything you believe in, strongly believe in, you can just take out Nietzsche and apply it to yourself, which is also again funny because Nietzsche was deconstructing a lot of things, and you also really find people liking Nietzsche, even though he clearly deconstructed what they probably believe in, right? And so what you said is absolutely true. Like, I would never say that I really understand Nietzsche. I would just say that I like what I think about when I'm reading Nietzsche. So it's basically like he's an inspiration for a journey of thought, I think. So, for example, when he analyzes how if he analyzes the way of suffering in life, I'm not thinking about, oh, okay, cool, that makes me now better than others again. No, I just really intrinsically like it, to think about what Nietzsche is writing. Or also when he talks about that there's no objective truth, there's only interpretation. I mean, what the hell is that supposed to mean? But then really letting yourself go on that journey and really kind of applying it to yourself, I think that's really cool. So I would say, in summary, a healthy way of reading Nietzsche is one of self reflection. A probably more unhealthy way of reading Nietzsche is reading his parts where he really talks about the distinguishing of higher humans versus the masses, which I think can go down a dark road very quickly if you only focus on those parts in his philosophy. And I think it's
Yeah,
very important to say that Nietzsche was probably a quite sad character, right? He was probably a quite frustrated and depressed. I would say he was quite a bipolar and a frustrated person. And I think that's reflected in his books, right? You have these highs of him, like Das Book Zarathustra, which is a very dopamine active and wild book, I would say. And you have these very cold and calm books like Beyond Good and Evil, where you probably can see, okay, now he's really more like an analyst. So let's also think about Nietzsche. Like he's everything from a critical, rational analyst to a super emotional, hyped writer who's more like concerned with epicness than I think actual facts. And so I think that diversity of how Nietzsche was thinking, feeling, and writing, I think that really makes him so appealing to me. And again, reading Nietzsche is I think reading Nietzsche should be the start of every philosophy education, because it's kind of like teaches you from the beginning, hey, probably everything you're going to read later is trash, but you need some meaning in your life. You cannot just live without any meaning. So I like to start with Nietzsche and philosophy and have your worldview deconstructed, and then reading other authors on your quest to find some purpose in this godless world.
yeah. Maybe a small consolation for people that feel like they don't understand Nietzsche is that he probably also didn't understand himself to a degree. And I think he was so constantly confronted with the mystery of reality and with his own mystery, basically, that it feels like he needed to write more like an artist needs to craft
Yeah,
something like
yeah.
this. This whole idea of philosopher as poet, I think, is something that Nietzsche really encapsulates, and which is such a stark contrast to this Kantian vision or this Hegelian vision of this like structured scientific model of the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I said, I think Nietzsche was a very driven, as you said, Nietzsche, I think, was a very driven person with a lot of emotions. And I think for him, writing these books was also a form of therapy. And I think they're genius form of therapy in the end. But you should also just not buy everything written in these books, but you should really read it and think about what you take out of it. I think that's the healthiest approach to philosophy in general. You should not do philosophy to found a fan club for someone. You should like ideas, and then if you like some ideas of Nietzsche and some ideas of Kant, for example, you just take the two ideas you like. You don't care that the two wouldn't agree with each other. You just take the parts that you like, and then you craft your own model of the world in the hope that it's the correct one, which is again linking us back to the free energy principle. And actually, if you think about it, Nietzsche writes a lot in his books about the subconscious. So many people also have accused Freud of having stolen the idea of the subconscious from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche predated Freud. And Nietzsche really wrote a lot about this distinguishing of a conscious and a subconscious part of the brain. And so again, I think when you say that Nietzsche was more a poet and like didn't understand himself, it is exactly because I think he was honest with himself that a lot of his thinking was not controlled by himself, but by something, well, that's the big mystery of the subconscious, right? Like by just some processing happening that he couldn't really access. And I think in the end of the day, like a lot of people are Friedrich Nietzsche's, right? They have a lot of ideas, very contradicting ideas. They also have contradicting values and beliefs. And if they would just write everything down in a very self-critical way, I think you would also find more radical thoughts, but also crystal clear thoughts in your own writings. So I think, yeah, what I like about Nietzsche is that he writes a lot about being overhuman, but in the end, I think he was human, all too human, and that's I think what makes him very likable for me.
Yeah, it's the menschliche als menschliche perspective. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe the also from a Jungian perspective, this whole idea of the unconscious was already hanging in the air, and the
Yeah.
collective unconscious of mankind was just waiting to be discovered.
It's waiting to be discovered. Love it.
Yeah. Where we can now move on to ACIT,
Sure.
which is
Sure.
do a little bit of self-advertisement, but also maybe to bring people. I think people have already, if they have listened this far, realized that we quite enjoy talking about ideas and like
Absolutely.
living this exchange. And I think this podcast is also one of our forums that is meant to serve exactly that purpose. But we can start more historically. Why did you found ACIT
Mhm.
initially? And
I think so. I'm going to be very honest here. This is going to be a very honest approach because I do value honesty and truth. As you see, I like to deconstruct everything, but also there are some values I cling to. So I think the origin of ACID was very simple. It was just me walking through Zurich and with friends, like on an individual basis, like meeting someone who studied sociology, for example. Remus, hey to you if you're listening this, just walking around with him in Zurich and talking about sociology and learning from that person about sociology. So I was so hungry for knowledge, right? I was like studying psychology, and I realized every science in itself is worthless. You really have to connect it to the bigger picture to understand what your science actually means in the world. So I realized if I only stay a psychologist, I'm never going to be a good psychologist. And so I kind of really wanted to understand what other people were thinking. So I met a lot of people always. Like I met people who were working on AI development, right? And really talked with them about it and really tried to understand, is artificial intelligence actually anything to do with the intelligence we talk about in psychology? I met with sociologists and tried to understand how they're more culture and society level thinking, how it relates to the psychological individualistic perspective in psychology, and also how you can differentiate sociology with social psychology and stuff like that. Or I met a really great friend of mine, and she was a very avid Nietzsche reader, and she was really a huge Nietzsche fan. And I back then I was still like in this gray limbo where I was like, okay, cool, like everyone is great, right? And so it's kind of like also very nice to meet people who have very strong beliefs. And I just really met so often for walks in a park with people that one day I remember that I just got up in the morning and I realized, hey, wait, if I enjoy this so much and it's very inefficient to meet these people individually, why don't I just make a discussion group where all these people can come together, and then in the discussion of different people, they will also unravel new thoughts that I wouldn't think about, right? So it was, I think ACIT was founded, to be very honest, on a combination of my curiosity for on my thirst for new knowledge, but also my, I would say, humility at the end of the day, of saying, hey, I probably don't ask the best questions to all these people. Maybe if I bring other people in this room, they will ask better questions than me. And so that's also how the first ACIT meetings happened. I was usually more in the back and just letting people speak, and sometimes said some things. I was more of a moderator. And in the beginning, ACIT meetings, they started in my living room, just in my flat in Zurich. And then at one point, there was, of course, in pre-corona times where you could still do these cool kind of things. And then at one point of time, more and more people joined, and more people brought their friends, and suddenly our my living room was just not big enough anymore to contain all these people. And then we started. It was summer, and we started going to the park, to the Irklu Park, which is still my favorite park in Zurich. And we just did tours there. We just walked like in smaller groups across around this park for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, and just discussed the topic within science, philosophy, or business. And I think that's the very origins of ACIT, how it started. Like, it was a discussion group, and it was meant to be a bridge between academic disciplines and a bridge beyond just studying one thing. And then kind of like ACIT developed, and we started doing more entrepreneurial projects. So we had this sport association we founded in Zurich because we thought, okay, cool, having a healthy mind is great, but let's also focus on having a healthy body. So we were doing this, and then we were also trying to have more impact on an education level. So we were thinking like, okay, cool. Let's also think about doing social impact projects in Africa and help people in Uganda, children in Uganda, go to school. So we were doing a crowdfunding there to make this real. And then also the University of Zurich, they and ETH, they gave us how do you say this? They acknowledged us as their own school club. So we kind of like were suddenly having university lecture halls where we can really doing talks, like a professor was giving talks to students. We really had this kind of facility suddenly. And then things really grew organically, and they grew very uncontrolled, I would say. So we were just really open for any project we could do, as long as it was related to like education and kind of developing something to provide to other people. And so kind of like also like there was a big Manu, you will smile now, I think there was a big challenge in making our webpage, because we had so
Yeah,
many different projects we were working on, right? That it was very hard to crystal clear say what ACIT is. And so it started really as a discussion group between intellectual thinkers, then developed more into an entrepreneurial hub for trying out ideas with a network of driven and smart people. And then kind of like in 2000, I would say 2019, Manu, right? Or was it 2018 when we really, really started the big vision revamp and everything? I think
yeah,
2019.
I think 19. Yeah,
Yeah. And then in 2019, really, it was more like this big revamp where we were rebranding ourselves as ACIT Global, because we didn't want to be only Switzerland based. We wanted to become global. And then we also took both the origins with the discussion groups that are so important to ACIT, but also this entrepreneurial spirit that we were forming in the next years, and really we're thinking about, okay, let's do a reboot of ACIT structures across the world. Let's really start expanding. So now, as you all know, we have our branches in Germany and Switzerland. We have branches in Belgium and in Canada. We're also working on a Beijing branch and on an Irish branch. We once had an Oxford branch, which sadly kind of died off because no one stays in Oxford after their graduation, and now people are working all over the place. But basically, it's kind of like we're also working on a Yale branch that's going to open, I think, this or next year. So it's kind of like really this idea of making ACIT global. And I think what we really need to see here is it started as a completely chaotic and just casual discussion group in my flat, right? That was the origin of ACIT. and we kind of try to keep this casual and nice spirit, but of course also combine it with Google best practices and Amazon best practices. So I think a lot of the way um, how ACIT is operating and managed on a global scale, I just copy it from Google, like well-being wise, definitely from Google, and also took some things from Amazon when it's about efficiency, right? And I think you can feel that ACIT is really managed in a way that it combines different tech ways of working. And so, yeah, if you ask me about the history of ACIT, it's really a development from a casual discussion group in Switzerland or in Zurich only towards a bit more professionalized club at universities across Switzerland, and then also developing into an entrepreneurial hub for everyone's crazy ideas, as long as they create an impact for people in the world, so as long as they have a social benefit. And then after some years of just really doing everything we could, just really more for the fun of it and for the impact, of course, we really did this large reboot in 2019, creating ACIT Global and seeing Switzerland as one hub, but then also expanding, as we said now, into other countries, really with the vision of providing a non-profit community and network to the world that is dedicated to spreading free education, by providing our online content like this podcast, by providing YouTube videos, by providing coaching about careers and PhDs and whatever else, but also by really still sparking meaningful discussions around science, business, and philosophy. And yeah, I would say that is ACIT in a nutshell, a grown discussion group from a Zurich flat, but at the same time also more and more a professionalized institution, really seeking to make some good impact in the world with free education.
Yeah, and it's from the perspective of me as someone who has been with ACIT now since 2019 with a global revamp and with this developing this new vision and these new practices. I think it's also an incredibly exciting journey to do, and I think it's still very fascinating because we have this scientific discussions just as we had now, but it's also really interesting to just do something like that
Yeah.
to have maybe the audacity or the naivety or both to just like think of doing something that sounds so amazing on paper, like getting this international network going and just meeting people all over the globe and having an exchange of ideas with like all of these people, but doing it in a like a structured and like scalable way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's exactly again maybe when we can go back again to really our academia and business discussion, right? I think that's exactly where I see the future of academia. So you still stay true to your roots of this discussion and this ivory tower thinking. You should keep that, as I think ACIT needs to keep its meaningful discussions, right? ACIT cannot only become a content provider. I think ACIT is really about the discussion and the people, right? And I think staying true to these roots, but making it better by applying best practices from business is the same I would do for academia. Stay true to your roots, but learn from the business best practices to make your processes better. And I think that's exactly also how we try to work at ACIT. So it's a very non-hierarchical, agile development that we try to nurture. And yeah, if anyone is interested listening to this, like please send me reach out to me. I would really be happy to welcome new people to the team. We're really growing quickly. I think at the moment we have 10 new roles open in total. So yeah, and we have 10 new roles open because we need 10 new people. It's not just for fun. So we're really growing quickly. And yeah, if anyone wants to be part of this journey, please reach out to me, and I would be very happy to talk to you.
Yeah, and we are now starting to develop also the opportunities to just tune in for a shorter time if you don't have the
Yeah,
capacity for
exactly.
like a really long term.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. So that's maybe we can just lose a second. So what we're going to do in ACIT soon is we're going to have these excellency programs, like which really like for students, it's like a program where we provide them with the opportunity to develop skills, right? So it's a voluntary project, ACIT. We also never charge anyone for anything, and our global operations, to be very honest, are run by my wallet. So every cost that happens, I just pay for it myself, unless of course sometimes for one event we have sponsors, but on a global level like the day-to-day things, if there are any costs then I'm paying for them. And so ACIT is really a non-profit, and I really never want to charge people for being part of ACIT, right? Because I think the project started as an intrinsical project to further interdisciplinary discussions, and I think charging for that sounds wrong. And so that's kind of like why it's a voluntary basis. We also have to respect that people working here, they're giving us a lot. They're doing this for the sole purpose of making the world a better place, right? And I think that's very honorable. All the people working at ACIT, I'm really, really grateful, of course, also for all the people who like this idea and who want to make this project become reality. But now we also thought about, okay, how can we kind of give people something back other than just intrinsic value? And we kind of starting this skill program where we're really giving official ACIT certificates to people who stay in ACIT for half a year or for a year and really do their role right. And then we kind of really I testify this with written letters and recommendation letters and everything else that may be attractive to people. So I think that's really like also the big idea where we have grown to a degree and our brand is recognized to a degree where we can also really start thinking about things like this. And I think that's super cool. Again, I always have in mind these times where we were like 5 people in my living room, and now we're talking about global organization and kind of like starting these uh, these certificate programs and these training programs. And I just really think that it shows again that if you're passionate about something and just keep doing it, your passion was jump over to other people and spark them as well. And then if you just have a small core group of a few people who really, really believe in something, you can make a lot of work. And that's again a shout out to academia. If you have just 5 people in your team, but you all really believe in an idea, do a startup and go to the business world. It's yeah, 5 people or just 3 people or just one person with a strong vision and the willingness to make something happen, they can go very far.
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful way to wrap this up, because I also my lunch is
That's a
moving
very
very
high
close.
priority. Your utility function and dopamine are spiking right now, I think.
Yeah, and my parents are sending angry messages like the perks of going and uh, visiting home for the Easter break. Yeah,
Perfect. No, yeah, thank you very much, Manu, for this great podcast. Like I'm frequently listening into the amazing podcasts you're doing, and now it's a big honor for me as well to be on one myself. So thank you very much for this.
yeah, this was a super cool conversation, and maybe we can do this at a different point again. I
Yeah,
think we
gladly.
still have stuff to talk about, and yeah.
We